On March 15, 2009, during launch preparations for STS-119, a free-tailed bat, injured and frightened, latched onto the foam insulation of the Space Shuttle Discovery's fuel tank. It clearly had no idea what was about to happen. As the solid rocket boosters roared to life, ground control noticed the little dark spot against the orange fuel tank, but it was too late to do anything about it. As the shuttle lifted off the pad, they watched the intrepid little bat hold on for dear life, rising higher and higher into the atmosphere. They never saw this bat fall off the fuel tank. It's very possible that it did, but the general belief is that the bat hung on until it eventually ran out of oxygen, slipped the surly bonds of Earth, and echolocated the face of God. Space Bat, as it came to be known, spawned millions of memes and drawings all across the internet. This plucky little cave dweller that went out on the wildest ride any bat has ever experienced touched the hearts of nerds around the world. Space Bat was not the first animal to get to space, though. There have actually been many animals that have been to space over the years. Space Bat's the only one that did so by choice. So I thought it'd be cool to do a video where I look at all the animals that have gone to space. You know, we all know about some of the animals that went up in the early days when they were just testing and stuff. I thought it'd be cool to tell their stories. And there were two things that I learned looking into this. One, there have been a lot of animals that have gone to space. Like, it's actually kind of impossible to get an accurate number, so I did my best to make a complete list. Some of this is going to have to be estimates for reasons I'll get to here in a minute. And second, this is going to be a much sadder video than I thought it was going to make. Yeah, a lot of these animals didn't make it. So if you're an animal lover, which I consider myself to be a bit of an animal lover, this might not be the easiest video to get through. The goal here, of course, is to celebrate the lives of these animals and not, you know, dwell on the bad stuff, but still. Consider that a content warning, I guess. So humans have been using animals to test aerospace vehicles really from the very beginning. You might remember from my airships video, the Montgolfier brothers, they tested their first balloon with a duck, a chicken, and a sheep on board. So of course, before we put people into space, we did it first with animals, the most famous of which was Laika the dog. Laika was literally a stray on the streets of Moscow when she was found in 1957. She was about 3 years old, possibly a husky terrier mix. She was one of many stray dogs that were brought in based on their size and temperament. Yeah, being that this was going to be a one-way trip, they probably assumed it would be easier to just find a stray dog than, you know, ask someone to give up their pet. But yeah, through the training process of these dogs, Laika kind of rose to the top by being the easiest to work with, the most calm and compliant in the little capsule they built, and eventually got picked for the Sputnik 2 mission. By the way, her name wasn't originally Laika. They called her Little Curly at first, but during a radio interview with one of her trainers, she kind of went into a bit of a barking fit in the background, so after that they started calling her Laika. Laika means barker in Russian. So they trained her by getting her used to smaller and smaller compartments over time, and the idea was that they were going to feed her through an automated feeding device for about a week or so until her oxygen ran out, and of course, during that time they would monitor her vital signs and stuff to gather data. This is kind of cute. The trainer later confessed that he actually took her home with him the night before the liftoff just to kind of play with her and give her, you know, one nice night before the send-off. Sputnik 2 with Laika on board launched on November 3rd, 1957 on board an intercontinental ballistic missile. Laika became the first living creature to orbit the Earth, and her image and name were printed on the front pages of newspapers all around the world. She was, and still is, one of the most famous dogs of all time. Sadly, the story of her, you know, zooming around the world, eating kibble, having the time of her life was a lie. The fact is, it came out about 50 years later. She actually died within hours of reaching orbit. The cause of the death was overheating, and the cause of the lie was, you know, the space race. A month earlier, Russia had just shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1. They didn't want to lose face over a dog, so they lied.
There's a dead dog in space.
So, yeah, like I said before, it's tragic, but Laika paved the way for human habitation in space. There's a monument for her in Moscow, and she's included on the monument for lost cosmonauts at Star City. So Laika was the first animal to reach orbit, but she was not the first animal that we put in space. That distinction goes to fruit flies. Way back in 1947, scientists wanted to know what cosmic radiation would do to DNA, so they took a V2 rocket that they had acquired from Germany after the war and put a little compartment on top of it, filled with fruit flies. The reason they went with fruit flies, technical term Drosophila melanogaster, was because just a year before, Hermann Joseph Miller had won the Nobel Prize for discovering how to mutate the flies with X-rays. So yeah, why not see if cosmic rays would do the same thing? So on February 20th, 1947, the flies were launched past the Kármán line and parachuted back to Earth. They made it down without incident. Don't get used to that. Anyway, it turned out that the radiation was mostly harmless to fruit flies, or so it seemed. It turned out later studies showed higher levels of genetic mutations as well as an impaired immune systems. How they tested these flies' immune systems, I don't know. Maybe tiny masks were involved. But yeah, fruit flies were aerospace pioneers. They weren't the last either. Many fruit fly experiments have gone to space. In fact, there's a fruit fly lab on the International Space Station right now with thousands of test subjects. Yeah, fruit flies have been used in biological and genetic tests for a long time now because they reproduce quickly, so you can see generational changes in a short amount of time. So it's not really any surprise that they'd be used in biological tests in space. So after the successful fruit fly launch, scientists decided to make a significant jump in scale, and in June 1948, a monkey was sent to space. Almost. It was a 9-pound rhesus monkey named Albert. This one fell a bit short, just reaching 63 kilometers, which is sad. Even sadder, Albert didn't make it. He suffocated in the cramped cabin, possibly before it even launched. 1 year later, they tried again with his successor, cleverly named Albert II. On June 14th, 1949, Albert II launched on a V2 in a roomier capsule. This vehicle reached 133 kilometers, making him the first primate in space. But on descent, his parachute failed to open, and Albert II was killed on impact. The good news, if you want to call it good news, was that the health monitors did work all the way up to the end, so the experimenters were able to prove that, primates could survive a trip to space. So, there's that. A few months later, they did a similar launch on a V2 with a crab-eating macaque this time, this one named Albert III. Why Albert? I don't know. This one, unfortunately, exploded before it reached apogee, which ended the short career of Albert III. Albert IV made it to space in December 1949, also on a V2, but the parachute failed and he died. In 1950, they flew the last V2 mission, this time with just a mouse on board, because I guess they ran out of monkeys. But this mouse reached space, came back down, learned how to cook, and took over the operations of a French restaurant, except no, its parachute failed and it also died. Excuse me just a second. I love you. I would never let anything happen to you. I love you so much. From here, the US did their tests on Aerobee rockets, which are basically our version of a V2. The first launch was another monkey. This one went by Albert V. New rocket, apparently the same parachutes because they failed and he also didn't survive. Just so I'm clear, the only animal that survived so far were fruit flies. That's the one that worked. Okay. So, while the US was lowering the worldwide population of monkeys, the Soviets were experimenting with dogs. Yeah, Laika was the first dog to go into orbit. There were other dogs before her that were suborbital. The first two were named Dezik and Tsygan. They were launched together on July 22nd, 1951, in a Soviet R-1V rocket, which is basically their version of a V2. They reached an altitude of 110 kilometers, and guess what? They actually survived. Both of them. That's right, the godless commies actually brought them home alive, making them the first mammals to survive a trip to space. Tsygan became the pet of a Russian diplomat, but Dezik went back up on a launch just a week later, this time with a dog named Lucy, making it the first mammal to go to space twice, but they did both die in a parachute accident. Back in the US on September 20th, 1951, they launched a monkey called Yorick into space. They started to name it Albert VI, but then wisely decided maybe it was time to retire that name because of all the, dying. But yeah, Yorick went up, this time with 11 mice tagging along, and the name change must have worked because finally, the parachute worked, and after ascending to 72 kilometers, Yorick and his 11 mouse friends landed safely in the New Mexico desert. And then died by overheating in the sun before the rescue people got to them. On May 21st, 1952, two crab-eating macaques named Patricia and Mike went up on an Aerobee rocket. They only reached 26 kilometers, but the parachutes actually worked, and they actually survived. Finally. Okay, so jump forward about 5 years. There have been some more tests, some more successful than others. The Soviets have gotten Laika into orbit, and the space race is really heating up. Under pressure to match the Soviets, the US started testing on Jupiter missiles, and on December 13th, 1958, a squirrel monkey named Gordo flew on a Jupiter AM-13 to an altitude of 500 kilometers. And no, the parachutes didn't work. Gordo died. A little over 6 months later, on May 28, 1959, a similar launch took place that included a rhesus macaque named Abel and a squirrel monkey named Miss Baker. They went up to 500 kilometers, and this time, guys, they lived. They lived! They lived even though they experienced a mind-blowing 38 Gs at launch. Humans pass out at around 9 Gs. So yes, they survived the launch. Sadly, Abel did die soon after from a complication. They had implanted sensors in both of them, health sensors, and when they went to remove them, Abel suffered some complications from the anesthesia. Miss Baker, however, lived another 25 years. She was a popular attraction at the Naval Aerospace Medical Center in Florida and later the U.S. Space Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. She didn't die until 1984 and was possibly the oldest recorded squirrel monkey ever. Total badass. And if you're ever in Huntsville, there's a monument for Miss Baker where you can pay your respects by leaving a banana. Shortly after Abel and Baker's flight, the Soviets launched a rabbit into space named Marfusha. She flew with 2 dogs plus some other animals on a Soviet R-2A rocket. Marfusha and the pups made it home safe. Finally, these animals are going to start surviving. We're past the worst of it. In fact, the first animals to orbit the Earth and live were, of course, launched by the Soviets. It was a pair of dogs named Belka and Strelka in August of 1960. Actually, there was a whole menagerie of animals on that flight, including a rabbit, 40 mice, 2 rats, 15 flasks of fruit flies, some plants, and a partridge in a pear tree. Fun fact, later on, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, gave one of the puppies of Strelka to Caroline Kennedy. Apparently, the descendants of those puppies are still out there somewhere, but I couldn't track them down. I thought that would be fun, but I couldn't find them. Strelka herself, along with Belka, lived a long and fruitful life, and after they died, their bodies were preserved and put on display at the Moscow Cosmonautics Memorial Museum. Okay, so this is where things start to really heat up between the Soviets and the Americans. They're preparing to launch people into space, and in the US, this meant testing the Mercury Redstone rocket. So in January of 1961, the US flew a chimp named Ham on a Mercury Redstone 2, making him the first great ape in space. So Ham had been trained to manipulate a series of levers and buttons and stuff to see if he could still perform those while he was weightless. And this was a 16-minute flight. They noticed only a half-second delay, which actually proved that people would be capable of controlling craft in space. That sounds like kind of a duh statement today, but up to this point, all the animals that had gone up to space were just kind of cargo, basically, with electrodes all over him and stuff. Ham was the first one that was actually doing things up there. Ham was on a suborbital flight. It went up to 252 kilometers, and thank the gods, his parachute worked, and he survived. This time it was a splashdown in the sea, which also might have been a first. In fact, there's a photo where he famously shook hands with the naval commander that rescued him. Ham lived out a long and happy life in zoos, and he died in 1983. So a few months after Ham's flight in 1961, the Soviets launched Sputnik 4, one of the craziest space stories ever, with a dog on board named Chernushka, or Blackie. But Chernushka had a very interesting co-pilot. It was a mannequin that they named Ivan Ivanovich. It was wearing a prototype spacesuit loaded with sensors, obviously to test out the rigors of the suit and the stresses that a human would feel. And inside the limbs of this suit, they stuffed samples of human blood, which makes sense, but also 80 mice, several guinea pigs, and various reptiles. Like you do. Even wilder, they ejected Ivan from the capsule on the way down. So yeah, this was one of the options that the Soviets were considering in returning the cosmonauts down to Earth. They didn't know if it would be safer to just land them in the capsule or to have them sort of yeeted out and parachute down like a skydiver or a paratrooper. So they tested both on Sputnik 4. Chernushka came down with the capsule, and Ivan and his animal-stuffed limbs came down separately. And they all survived. Oh my god, the Americans were just splatting so many monkeys, and the Russians were literally throwing animals out of their capsules and they still survived. I've officially gone from, oh my god, so many animals died, to, oh my god, so many animals survived. One last little cherry on top of this story is that Ivan actually came down on farmland that were owned by some locals, and so they rushed out thinking he was a real person to help them, and then they got warned off by paratroopers that were nearby. Like, imagine if they got to him and opened up his spacesuit and literally, like, hundreds of animals spilled out. Sputnik 4 was bonkers. So a few weeks later, they basically repeated that exact same mission, this one under the name Vostok 1. And instead of filling the spacesuit with a bunch of random animals, they filled it with Yuri Gagarin. And the era of human spaceflight was officially begun. And I think the ultimate takeaway here is that, you hear all about the first humans in space and how far we've come in human spaceflight and whatnot, how far we've come since then and everything, but we rarely hear how much testing was needed to get there. I mean, this literally went back decades before the first manned missions. And who would have thought that of all the technical wizardry involved in rockets that it takes to get to space, that one of the things they struggled with the most was the parachutes? It took a lot of sacrifices by some extraordinary animal astronauts to get us there. So the next time you watch in awe as a crew heads up to the ISS or on the next moon missions, just take a minute to give thanks to our intrepid animal friends and the path that they carved so that we can live out our dreams. There's so many more, though. A second chimp named Enos went up on November 29th, 1961. This one actually went into orbit, making him the only chimp to actually orbit the Earth. So, like, if Ham was the simian Alan Shepard, then Enos was the simian John Glenn. Enos was scheduled to orbit the Earth 3 times, but was deorbited after 2. Unfortunately, this accomplishment kind of got overshadowed by the fact that Gagarin and Titov had already gone up. The first cat in space was launched by France in 1963. It was a launch performed by, God help me, the Centre d'Enseignement de Renseignement de Médecine Aéronautique.
Je m'appelle Claude.
Je découpe plow.
Or CERMA. I'll stick with CERMA. 14 strays were drafted into the program. They were tested for fitness before one cat was picked to fly. And she was given the name Félicette, and what they were most concerned with was learning how the brain responded to microgravity, so they surgically implanted electrodes into her brain. On October 18, 1963, Félicette took to the skies in a Veronique AGI sounding rocket over Algeria, and she performed like a champ. Panic would have made her brain scans useless, but she stayed chill for the entire 15-minute ride. It took her up to 160 kilometers. And yes, the parachutes worked. She totally survived the trip. Unfortunately, CERNA really wanted to know what was going on inside of her brain, so they euthanized her to run some tests. In 2019, a statue of Félicette was installed at the International Space University in Strasbourg, France. This is not Félicette necessarily, but it can be if you want it to be. I'll put a link to this shirt down in the description. A second cat was sent to space by CERMA on October 24, 1963, but the flight ran into some difficulties and prevented her recovery. The first frogs in space were launched by the USSR in 1961. The first animals to circle the moon were 2 Russian steppe tortoises, along with an assortment of worms and flies. This was on the Zond 5 mission, which splashed down in the Indian Ocean, and all the inhabitants were recovered alive. Those Russian tortoises beat the Americans on Apollo 8 by just a few months. The Zond 5 mission is kind of considered by many to be the last time the USSR beat the US in the early space race. The first spiders in space went up on Skylab in 1973 to see how well they spun webs in zero gravity. And if you're curious, the answer is not so great at first, but they got the hang of it. And that experiment was actually suggested by a high school student, so that's cool. The spiders were named Arabella and Anita, and if you want to see them, you're in luck. They were preserved and are on display at the National Air and Space Museum in Chantilly, Virginia. Speaking of bugs, let's talk about nematodes. Nematodes are little worm-like creatures with really short lifespans, so they're ideal for testing the effects of multiple generations of life in space. And because of that, they've become kind of legendary in spaceflight research. The first ones to go into space were actually on the Apollo 17 mission, along with bacteria, sea monkeys, and 5 mice named Fee, Fi, Fo, Fum, and Fooey. Those didn't actually land on Apollo 17, by the way. They went around in orbit with the command module. But yeah, nematodes have been used in countless space experiments over the years. One of the most famous ones was actually the last flight of Columbia in 2003. Yeah, they actually found living nematodes amongst the wreckage after Columbia broke apart in the sky. That's how hardy these things are. Now, mind you, they were not the nematodes that went up on the shuttle. They were either the great or great-great-grandchildren of the originals. That's how fast they reproduce. More recently, in 2017, nematodes were named as one of the 2 animals that could become the first interstellar travelers. Yeah, Professor Philip Lubin of UC Santa Barbara discussed sending frozen nematodes on a future laser-propelled space trip outside our solar system. Because not only can these guys survive freezing and thawing, most can fertilize their own eggs. Whether or not it's cool to send living creatures outside of our solar system across the universe is another question. It's a bit yikesy for me. The other animal Professor Lubin suggested should be a surprise to absolutely no one: tardigrades. Also known as water bears, as most of you already know, they were first singled out as candidates for space research back in 1964. It wasn't really till 2007, though, that multiple tardigrade experiments got started. The best known of these experiments involved actually exposing tardigrades to the vacuum of space. 3,000 water bears went into a vacuum on an ESA satellite. Now, ultraviolet radiation did kill some of them, but most of them survived. Tardigrades are crazy. And in 2019, a privately funded lunar lander named Beresheet set out with a payload that also included tardigrades. A computer error caused it to crash into the moon, unfortunately, but according to analysis of the crash, they may have survived. They had been dehydrated before the launch, and when that happens, they enter almost like a spore state that makes them almost indestructible. It also makes them, to the best of my knowledge, the first non-human animals on the moon. And they suffered the fate of many of the first animal astronauts on Earth. Great liftoff, but didn't stick the landing. And we'll find out someday if they survived. Once we've successfully colonized the moon, maybe 100 years from now, some future astronauts will make their way to the Beresheet wreckage and find out once and for all if these tardigrades made it through. And when they do, they'll know that the only reason they got to that point were thanks to Laika, multiple Alberts, and many other animals that came before. And there's so many more, guys. Literally hundreds of animals have gone to space. and you haven't. This was such a rabbit hole that I wasn't expecting. I left a lot out of this. I kind of do a quick rundown of some more interesting ones over on Nebula. I always put extra stuff in the videos over there. Thankfully, after a certain point, most of these animals survive, but in the beginning, yeah, whew, yikes. Animal testing, of course, is not restricted to the space industry. In fact, you'd kind of be hard-pressed to find any industry that's completely free of it. And it's a hotly debated topic. You know, some people will say that no amount of animal testing is okay because they can't consent to it. Others will say it's just, you know, a necessary evil that's benefited all of us, whether we agree with it or not. But yeah, I'm curious to hear what you guys think in the comments. You know, was it all worth it? Could we have gotten the same data in more ethical ways? Talk about it down below. So look, you might not be as qualified to go to space as, say, a dog or a cat or a monkey, but it's possible that you could cook as well as a rat. It's easy with today's sponsor, HelloFresh. And yes, thank you, that was a perfect segue. So we all know that the cost of going out is getting just completely ridiculous lately, so a lot of people are opting to stay in and cook, which is great. And maybe you've got a whole pile of recipes that your mom gave you or something, but you know, you always got to go to the store to find, you know, to get this one thing that you don't have, and then sometimes the instructions are vague, and it just never quite ends up like you expect, you know? Well, HelloFresh fixes all that. First of all, you get all of the ingredients pre-packaged so you don't have to go to the store. That's less time out of your day, less gas to put in your car, and plus they give you the exact amount you need, so that's less waste. The instructions are super easy, they're totally clear, they even give you pictures of what to do, so literally anybody can follow it, and the end result is always restaurant quality amazing, but for far less money. Especially if you're a hummingbird like me, you'll probably get at least 2 meals out of it. So yeah, it's like eating at a restaurant, but you can eat it on the couch in your pajamas watching movies. Actually, why isn't there a restaurant where you can do that? That would be a hit. Plus, you get that smug satisfaction of knowing that you cooked it yourself. You're kind of like a kid on a bike with training wheels. Like, you know you had a lot of help, but hey, check me out. Plus, cooking is a fun thing to do together. My wife and I love doing it. Anyway, bottom line, if you haven't checked out HelloFresh, try it. It's pretty great. And if you sign up at my link below and use the code JoeScott16, you'll get 16 free meals with free delivery. So, I mean, like, think about how much money you would spend going out to a restaurant 16 times. You're getting that for free. Oh, and I almost forgot, you can also choose from several different meal options, from vegetarian to meat and veggies, pescatarian, for families of all sizes. So you know you'll find something you like. All right, so one more time, that's HelloFresh.com, promo code JoeScott16 for 16 free delicious meals, and it helps support this channel. So yeah, go check it out. All right, big shout out to the Answer Files on Patreon and the channel members that are supporting this channel with their dollars, making it so that we can keep doing this and keep the lights on and pay my team and grow. We're really trying to try some new things on here, and having that sort of, you know, baseline support from you guys. I can't tell you how much it makes that possible, so I really do appreciate it. We got some new members I want to shout out real quick. We got Dan Walker, Christine Stotsbury, RC Gray, Ian Dempsey, Barbara Estes, Pecan7, Laszlo216, Moke4, Silvaria928, lots of numbers here, Hivdurul or Herman XD, Wade Chadwick, Ghost of Stacy Pope Alina, and Sooner in the Blue Oasis. That's a beautiful name. Thank you guys so much, and if you'd like to join them, not only does it support the channel, but you get some really cool perks. You get early access to videos, you get exclusive access to live streams that nobody else can go to, and as members, you get a little thing next to your name down there that makes you stand out a little bit. Always kind of fun. So yeah, if you want to do that, you want to join, just hit the little join button right below this video. All right, please do like and share this video if you liked it, and if this is your first time here, maybe there's a clip right here that you can go check out. Google thinks you might like that one, or look at any of the others that have my face on them in the little sidebar down below. Just take a look, and if you enjoy them, I do invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday. All right, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care.